Hello, listener. Thank you for stopping by. If you are hearing this, then you are likely searching for stories that get you into the proper spirit and mood of the day. At the time this is both being recorded and uploaded to the void that is the internet, it is the season of fearsome frights, when the veil between worlds grows thin and our imaginations are allowed to run unchecked. The stories you are about to hear are a selection of ones that were written over the course of the month of October in the year 2024. These were all written in a single draft during moments of creative frenzy, carved out of a busy and grueling work schedule. I cannot speak to their quality, but at least they are free. Whether you are enjoying this alone or are merely playing this as background to a Halloween party, I thank you for the time and attention. On that note, let's begin our first tale. It had been another late night, another agonizing shift. While the temperatures had dropped with the coming of autumn, she reeked of sweat, shame, and deep-fried chicken tenders. What was supposed to be a mere part-time job during a high school had become a full-time job in all but name as soon as she had graduated. While she had taken this path home many times, the fact that the sun was setting earlier and earlier had made the ordeal all the more unsettling. A thin, reflective windbreaker covered the polo shirt she wore as part of her uniform. Her small leather purse, bought at a discount from a going-out-of-business sale at a now-defunct department store, was squeezed tightly under her arm. To some, they would think she was trying to be extra cautious against potential thieves. But really, it was to prevent the skinny leather strap from digging into her skin. She wasn't a particularly fit woman. While she was relatively young, she was what some would consider reasonably plump. While other more affluent girls stood as columns and hourglasses, she was merely an apple. Her self-esteem was damaged further by the fact that she seemed to stop growing in her freshman year, standing at only 4'8". While she was, by all accounts, physically and mentally an adult, she would still get mistaken for a teenager from time to time. Such was the case when a customer who didn't understand that the fast food chain's special deal on cheesy bacon fries did not include a bacon burger, leading to a woman in her 70s to throw a tantrum in front of an already crowded restaurant. Try as she might, she was still rattled by the events of the day. The only thing keeping the anxiety at bay was the ever-present anxiety of being a woman walking by herself in public in the evening. Her belongings remained in her purse, and her eyes continually scanned for potential dangers. Even though she was in no rush, she walked quickly, keeping her face in a nigh-permanent scowl so that she looked angry. It was a trick passed down to her from her mother, who in turn learned from her mother. As she rounded the corner, she found herself at the public park, where she would often cut through in a bid to avoid the steady stream of traffic. Compared to other parts of the city, it was a large park with a decent amount of tree cover. A modern playground, clearly too small for the space the park was originally designed for, was nestled within, surrounded by a number of concrete paths that runners would often use for their morning jog. She glanced at it briefly as she walked through the park. She liked the old playground better. Designed around a number of rivers that ran through the area, the concrete paths wound through a number of different areas, some featuring pavilions and picnic tables, others featuring historic houses that were only allowed to remain standing due to their perceived cultural importance. At the other side of the park was a community fitness center that often functioned as a daycare for the community's busy parents. That community center was always a sign that she was halfway home. By now, the sun had fully set, and a full moon had begun shining in the sky, the lingering pollution laying a sickly orange tint over it. The building had just come into view when she heard it, the snapping of a twig. Alarm bells immediately began to ring in her mind, prompting her to quicken her pace further. As though in response, she began to hear something, or some things, scraping along the ground. Great, she thought. Another creep. Just what I need today. She didn't want to risk having whoever was following her knowing where she lived, so she took a sharp turn onto a different path, going deeper into a greener area of the park. While she knew going into an area with less light wasn't the brightest idea, she figured she could use the cover of darkness to escape her would-be pursuer. The scraping on the ground grew louder, but its rhythm seemed to break apart, as though someone was lifting from the ground and only lightly scratching in the brief periods of time where it made contact. She didn't dare look back, and only broke into a full sprint. Subtlety would have to be abandoned for the sake of survival. She left the walkway onto the grass, weaving through a set of trees that formed one of the many picnic spots. It also happened to be in an area out of view of the streetlights, meaning she was essentially running blind. However, she knew the layout of the park better than most, having frequented it during much of her childhood and adolescence. She hoped that whoever or whatever was pursuing her wasn't nearly as familiar with the terrain. Her heart beat rapidly, thundering in her ears. She could no longer tell whether she was still being pursued or if it had broken off to find easier prey. The only thought in her mind was to run and find another way home. The next thing she knew, she crashed face first into the ground. Her legs snagged on something, but she wasn't sure what. Her adrenaline was still surging through her body, so she clawed her fingers into the ground in an effort to get up. By the time she finally got to her feet, she found herself face to face with what had been pursuing her. The area of the park was shrouded in darkness, but she could tell that it wasn't human. A dark figure loomed over her. Clouds of wet fog pushed into the air from what she assumed to be a mouth, paired with a low, breathy pant. What little light remained appeared to flash in a pair of fierce, yellow eyes, which stared straight down at her. She tried to back away slowly, only to find her back next to a tree. Her breathing quickened, and the sweat from the run had almost immediately grown cold. She pulled her purse from her shoulder and flung it at the creature. There wasn't anything particularly heavy, but it had to do something. Almost immediately after she did so, she circled around the tree and continued running. By this point, she had completely lost her bearings. The trees and fixtures around her seemed to blur together into a massive shadow. Her body got battered by branches and bushes and various objects as she ran, but the adrenaline kept her going. Soon enough, she spotted an area of the park with light. Her now nearly blurry vision could make out the familiar sights of a playground and the main road. The sight of her running would no doubt catch someone's attention, she thought. Surely no one is going to ignore a woman in distress. Right as she was about to reach the edge of the playground, it happened. The hulking creature dropped right in front of her, blocking her escape. She desperately tried to juke to the right, but in a cruel twist of fate, her shin crashed into a concrete bench, sending her flying over and onto the ground. Her head rang from the impact, but she could still hear the footsteps, paired with the sound of the claws scraping the cobblestones and cement. She desperately tried to get up again, but her legs wouldn't cooperate. The creature now stood over her. Her heart pounded, her breath labored. All she could do was muster one last blood-curdling scream. While it echoed throughout the park, it fell on deaf ears. It had taken a long time. After months, if not years, of hard work, dozens of backroom deals, and a flurry of gullible test subjects, he had finally found it. The exact formula once created by Dr. Henry Jekyll himself. Soon, he would finally complete what the doctor never could. The exact salts and the exact contaminants had been difficult to figure out, especially since the mysterious Edward Hyde had destroyed all of the research materials. No one was really sure who Edward Hyde was, or how he came to be associated with an otherwise respected scientist. After the whole affair, the only person who could be considered his friend, Gabriel Utterson, had refused any and all attempts at communication. The only information and quotations attributed to him were given during a court hearing that followed the investigation into Jekyll's disappearance and Hyde's death. As for how he got what notes he had, Frederick had always been resourceful, often knowing how to find information that even seasoned scholars wouldn't be capable of finding. It is why it was fortunate that he happened to be working at the university where Dr. Jekyll had occasionally given lectures after being established as a man of science. As incomplete as the research materials were in the university archives, they were early enough in his research that if one simply expanded upon them with information that had emerged since the curious case, it stood to reason one could recreate his research perfectly. That, at the very least, was the hypothesis that Frederick had operated under. While no one knew exactly what Jekyll had been researching, rumors abounded in academic circles. Some say he was attempting to follow the tradition of the alchemists of yore, hoping to create the ultimate panacea to extend one's life in perpetuity. Others say he was hoping to devise a chemical method to rehabilitate the criminal mind, with many particularly citing his disdain for the efforts of his contemporary, Dr. Jack Seward, in Whitby. Sadly, Jekyll never got to witness Seward's downfall, following what would later be known as the Renfield disaster. For Frederick, he knew there had to be some truth to the latter. A compound to rid oneself of evil was the kind of modern miracle missing in the world of science. Something that could be administered like any other medication rather than resorting to barbaric procedures like lobotomization would no doubt render capital punishment obsolete. No longer would guilty sinners need to crowd the confession booth. No longer would people need to waste away in jail cells or workhouses. A society free from evil was something everyone wished for. Of that, he was certain. And here it was, in his hands, a bottle of that same formula, crafted after countless attempts. Most of the test subjects, which usually ranged from stray animals to the occasional drifter, had ended up dying. Some died right away, either shortly after or in the process of ingesting the compounds. Others, as the tests wore on, had a delayed reaction, usually manifesting in their stomach or lower abdomen. He had not yet tested this latest formulation. Law enforcement had already become suspicious, so finding test subjects was proving difficult. That no longer mattered. He was certain he had recreated the formula in the exact manner in which it was constructed by Dr. Jekyll himself. If all was going to plan, then he would need no other test subject than himself. The vial almost seemed to glow on its own from the compound. The bright green, translucent liquid beckoned to him, as though saying he was one small step away from greatness. He wasn't sure if it was a product of the various salts, or if his eyes were playing tricks on him in his anticipation. He wanted to savor this moment for as long as possible, but he knew he couldn't hesitate for too long. He raised the vial in front of him. With his other hand, he adjusted his glasses, and then he took a deep breath. This was it. No going back now. In one swift motion, he brought the vial to his lips, and immediately poured the liquid into his mouth. It took 2 gulps before it was finally empty. After he swallowed, he took some more deep breaths as he waited for the change. Nothing was happening. Of course, he thought, it must take time for the compounds to enter the bloodstream. He just needed to be patient. He took another deep breath. Still nothing. He then felt a gurgle in his stomach, but as the gas exited his posterior, the discomfort quickly subsided. He gazed at his reflection in a looking-glass. He still had the same meek features as before, his matted brown hair, his hazel eyes behind the pair of eyeglasses, and a pallor that no amount of time in the sun was going to change. Perhaps the change was more subtle, not viewed externally but felt internally. That must be it, he thought. There was only one way to test it. He walked over to the other end of his laboratory, clearing some of the books off of a small trunk. After opening it and rummaging around, he found his old keepsake box. It was a small box made of cardboard. It had originally been used to hold a shipment of biscuits and other confections from the bakery back in his hometown. After the food had been eaten, he had taken to using it to hold items of import. One such item was a series of letters, all coming from the same person, Oscar. They had grown up together as boys, but he moved away long before he had even completed his schooling. The letters were their correspondence back and forth. At first, it was the usual exchange of gossip and descriptions of their respective towns. As the years wore on, the letters delved into even deeper discussions. As he looked through each letter, the tactile memories seemed to rush back to him. The smell of the grass after they got caught in a rainstorm while on one of their long walks. The heat of the summer sun that day when they had visited the beach together. The tender embrace of his arms that day when... No. Why wasn't it working? Why hadn't there been a change? Did he make another mistake? Was the dose too small? The larger doses had killed the previous test subjects, so he erred on the side of caution. Did he need to make another batch? He felt his chest tighten, but he knew it wasn't from the formula. He put the letters back into their box and closed the trunk. His hands began to shake. Whether it was anger or fear, he couldn't say. Where did he go wrong? Why wasn't it working? Why hadn't he changed? His quick breaths soon gave way to heaving, which then turned into sobbing. He dropped to his knees in the middle of the laboratory, clutching his head as the tears began to flow. All of his efforts, all of the illicit favors he had to perform to get access to the ingredients and the equipment, all of the lives lost in prior test runs. What had it all been for? There had to be something he missed, some miscalculation. By all accounts, it should have worked. However, his eyes were too full of tears to allow him to look over any notes. His hands were shaking too much to be able to handle anything. As his emotions began to fully overtake him, only one question was left in his mind. Why? Why did he still love him? Zod had seen a number of things brought to the digital forensics lab. Old hard drives confiscated from sex offenders, burner phones ditched by gang members. The strangest had been a video game console that had been hacked to operate as a remote detonator for a failed terrorist attack. At least, that was the strangest. Until today, where the object du jour was a tiny digital camera. It was part of a line of retro-style point-and-shoot cameras, meant to evoke the consumer cameras of yore. They had been released in waves, each tied to a particular decade. This one in particular was a model meant to evoke the style of a camera in vogue during the 1920s, but in a smaller, more compact package that one could easily connect to their computer or smartphone. That was how it was supposed to work. However, this particular camera, brought to her by a homicide detective investigating a body found in a high school girl's bathroom, had clearly belonged to someone who had no qualms about voiding warranties and violating EULAs. While the standard software could allow just about anyone to take a photo and load it, this camera was loaded with some custom firmware that required some sort of authentication in order to retrieve the photos inside. Whether the victim was trying to hide the photos from a nosy relative, Uncle Sam, or even local law enforcement was something the detectives would have to figure out. For Zod, her job was to get inside to see what photos were on it in order to find any clue on what led to the death of the victim, a 14-year-old girl. From what the medical examiner had told her, the crime scene was a doozy. While the girl showed signs of distress and even what looked like defensive injuries, there was no visible blood loss nor signs of asphyxiation. The current hypothesis was some sort of internal hemorrhaging, but the autopsy was still being conducted. No bruises were seen on the body, and the defensive injuries seemed to be limited to the hands and feet, like she had attempted to push or kick something back, only for her strength to fail her at a critical moment. Aside from her clothing, the only other item on her person appeared to be this camera, which had been hanging from her neck by a camera strap. The strap wasn't wrapped around in a way to indicate that she had choked, but it did hang in a way that indicated that it had recently been used. Was she trying to photograph her attacker? Or had she been ambushed while taking a different photo? The answer lied on that camera. She had been trying different methods of breaking through the encryption. An auto-entry macro was out of the question, since the firmware appeared to have some sort of failsafe that locked out the user after 3 attempts. There were concerns that it would trigger an automatic deletion, similar to a smartphone, so detectives were now working to find any sort of clue as to what the password or passwords might be. What made things difficult was that despite the fact she appeared to have an interest in photography, she had no social media presence. Perhaps her parents were tech-savvy and weren't allowing her to have any social media accounts. It was also possible that she was simply too good at covering her tracks. The fact that she had gone to the trouble to jailbreak her own digital camera and install custom firmware lent credence to that possibility. The difficulty was what made the job all the more interesting for Zod. Due to how criminals were usually really bad when it came to securing their tech, coming across something that required actual effort was a welcome challenge. After all, she was the woman with 1,001 ways to hack. However, at the rate things were going, there was the possibility that this job could take just as long as her namesake's efforts to stay alive. The custom firmware was probably the most secure software she had ever encountered in her time with the lab. It was as though it had been built from scratch, as opposed to modifying the camera's original software. The effort it must have taken to not only jailbreak the camera, but to also completely overwrite the original software and have everything still function was almost otherworldly. She either had really smart friends or was some kind of coding wunderkind. A shame that she would never get to meet her. The camera was connected via a USB-C to USB-A cable to her workstation. As soon as she had first connected it to the computer, it asked for a password. However, it wasn't the usual default system menu. It had a custom window with graphics resembling pages of an ancient book, like something out of a fantasy story. Instead of asking for a password in the usual way, the window had the words, "Who dares to enter?" Below that was a box to enter text. Since brute forcing the password didn't appear to be an option, and she had yet to find any sort of exploits or backdoors, the window had been sitting on her screen for the past hour, a green cursor blinking as it awaited text. She initially thought it might be a reference to a book or a TV show that the victim enjoyed, but when detectives searched her bedroom and belongings, they couldn't find anything linked to fantasy or science fiction. There weren't even any items linking to journalism, activism, or even weird conspiracy theories. They told her that her bedroom looked as though it was designed for a magazine spread rather than as a bedroom for a teenage girl. Poor kid, she thought. Parents must be the kind focused on keeping up appearances. No wonder she had no social media. Weirder still was how, when detectives asked, neither parent knew about the camera. They each assumed the other had bought it for her. She had already tried the victim's name, Iris, but that hadn't worked. She tried checking to see if maybe she had some sort of nickname, but detectives said that, according to her parents and most teachers at the school she attended, she was very much a loner. Weirder still was how Iris didn't seem to have her own computer, and none of the school computers had any signs to indicate that they had been used to access the camera. Checking with local libraries had proven fruitless as well. In the days leading up to her death, no one had reported seeing her. No social media, no personal effects, or even anything to indicate what kind of person she was. What kind of sheltered, withdrawn life had she lived? How did she see the world? How did she carve out her few moments of freedom? The curiosity nagged at Zod more than she was willing to admit. "Who dares to enter? I dares," she said to herself. Shrugging her shoulders, she decided to try typing out her full first name. Scheherazade. The window faded to black. Another message began to type itself out. Secrets have a price. Offer truth to reveal truth. Ah, multiple passwords. Great. Her name being the first one was a happy fluke. Perhaps this was a clue. Something connected to 1001 Nights? She racked her brain trying to remember if there were any stories pertaining to secrets. Despite her name, her parents never actually read her all of the stories of 1001 Nights. The stories she was familiar with were the same stories that everyone was familiar with. What if it was something else? A price? Something tied to a hush money payout? No, that doesn't make sense. It says to offer truth to reveal truth. It likely means something that was paid in exchange for information. What kind of cover-up was busted after a payout? Perhaps she was overthinking it. Could it be a trick question like... She typed the word truth. The box turned black, revealing a larger window. A gallery. She was in. Not a very secure password. Perhaps she was giving the victim too much credit. That thought made her feel bad. She was just a teenage girl after all. She didn't get the opportunity to improve her cybersecurity skills. The window looked like any file explorer. Perhaps the fancy text box and graphics were just for the victim's own amusement. By default, the view had been set to show thumbnails of various photos. She switched the view to detail, but to her annoyance, the metadata on the photos appeared to be backdated to December 31st, 1969. This was definitely going to make things harder for the investigation, but not impossible. They would just have to see what clues the photos provided and hope they depicted something that would show a time and a place in a way that a defense attorney couldn't object to. She sorted the photos by name. While the names of the files weren't anything coherent, mainly a garble of numbers and letters, it could indicate how many photos were taken and over what span of time, assuming the victim was the only person using the camera. The first few photos didn't seem particularly noteworthy. They were mainly exteriors of some older buildings, followed by some interiors taken in a sequence, like some sort of real estate walkthrough. She recognized some of them from throughout the city, although she couldn't recall the buildings looking as pristine as they were in the photos. The first building appeared to be some sort of restaurant. She recognized it as a pizza place that turned out to be a front for a local gang. The bust had gotten a lot of attention due to the rundown state the building was in. In the photos, the building looked pretty clean, and the walkthrough showed fairly clean interiors. No pictures of food, though, nor people. For some reason, the last photo of the building showed what looked like the floor of the kitchen. It appeared to be spotless, with the tile being particularly shiny. As far as she knew, nobody had bought the building after the bust, but maybe Iris knew someone who was attempting to refurbish it. The next building was an old house that she recognized from one of her first cases in the forensics lab. It was a residential home that was operating as a nursery and daycare. The married couple who ran it got into a verbal argument that escalated to the wife killing the husband after she learned that the husband had been molesting the children in their care. The marriage had already been on the rocks, but the incident pushed her over the edge. She ended up dying in prison, but the DOC never revealed how. Like the previous set, it showed the exterior of the house before moving inward, showing the different rooms. The series of photos seemed to linger on what appeared to be a basement in the home. Part of it appeared to have been converted into a makeshift photo studio, as the photos began showing different backgrounds and lighting setups, but no people or items in any of the frames. The last photo in the series was of the bed in the master bedroom. The angle of the photo was eerily similar to the crime scene photo her mentor had taken when police found the body of the husband. He was lying on the bed face down after being hit in the back of the head with a miniature statue of the thinker. Iris seemed to have some sort of obsession with crime scenes. She must have been able to sweet-talk the new owners of the home into letting her take photos. Weird how they seemed to have the same kind of bed sheets. The third set of photos were where things were getting weird. The exterior shot clearly showed the prison where the wife had been sentenced. Weirder still was how the next few photos clearly showed the parts of the prison no civilian would have access to unless they had been sentenced for a crime or if they were a guard. It followed a set path down a number of halls past a number of cells. It was also strange how none of the cells had any prisoners inside, despite very clearly being locked. It was as though the building was empty. The sequence led to the prison showers, with the final photo showing one of the showers specifically. Even if she had asked in the nicest way possible, there was no way Iris would have been able to take these photos. The only reasonable conclusion was that she had gotten the camera secondhand. That also means someone who worked at the prison was taking photos that they shouldn't have been. Her suspicions were somewhat confirmed with the start of the next set of photos. It wasn't an interior shot like the previous ones, but it was a shot of what looked like the inside of a store. She recognized the logos of a charity thrift shop that operated in the city. The next shot looked as though it was taken from within a shopping bag. Iris must have just bought the camera at this point. Okay, now Zod was starting to see a timeline. The next photo was pretty mundane. A picture of a garden through the window of a room. Perhaps Iris was getting the hang of the camera. The next photo was clearly her bedroom. It was a low angle from what appeared to be underneath a desk. An office chair had been pushed into the desk, like when someone was sitting on it. The perspective placed the eyeline of the image level with the seat of the chair. Was Iris trying to make some sort of artistic statement? Based on what Zod had been told, she was an average height, so the lengths she would need to go to get this kind of shot showed a weird level of dedication. The next image caused Zod's brain to short-circuit. It was an image of a full-length mirror, with the opposite wall fully visible. However, it was shot from straight on in front of the mirror. Not only that, but it was clearly taken at eye level. She should have been visible in the frame, or at the very least the camera should have been. The photo existed in stark defiance to the laws of physics and all knowledge of photography. Even when it came to photographic trickery, there was a limit. There would be more obvious signs that the image had been edited, at least within the metadata. Furthermore, if it had been photoshopped, why would she go through the trouble to load it back onto the camera? Something wasn't adding up. The next photo was at a high angle, showing a section of floor. It was too far from the ground to be a mere accident. After the previous photo, she wasn't sure what to make of it. The next one after that was another high angle, this time of Iris's bed. The pillow was at the top of the frame, but not fully in frame. It was a very tight angle as well, with 2/3 of the frame filled with the bed. The photo after that showed a change of scenery. A bathroom. Another low angle, with the camera placed on the ground looking towards a wall. A tub could be seen to the side of the image. Something about the angle wasn't sitting right with Zod. It was at once familiar, yet foreign, resembling photos she had seen in other cases. However, it was clear something was missing. The next few images seemed to follow the same pattern, often showing both Iris's bedroom or the bathroom, all from angles that would not make sense if someone was trying to show off a building or make some sort of artistic statement. It wasn't until she scrolled through that she saw a different location. It resembled some sort of storage room, as evidenced by the presence of gym mats and other sports equipment, although she could barely make it out due to how dark it was. Next, the interior of a classroom. The camera was looking up at the ceiling from the perspective of a desk. At this point, she had given up on trying to follow the logic of the photos, especially after the sheer impossibility of some of the compositions. The next image showed a hall in Iris's school. It was empty, and the image was just below eye level. This appeared to be the theme for the next few images as it went down the hall, leading to the door to one of the restrooms. This was then followed by an image of one of the mirrors, once again at an impossible angle without any sign of the camera. The next image was that of the very bathroom stall where her body had been found. The stall door was wide open and the toilet seat down. It was eerily similar to the photo of the scene taken by one of the other crime lab members. Zod rubbed her eyes and forehead. As fascinating as it was to speculate, she realized that nothing about the images was giving any sort of clue as to what had actually happened. She grabbed her favorite sparkly mug, where she had been brewing a cup of her favorite rooibos chai, and took a sip. As she did so, she clicked over to the next image. It was the exterior of the police department. Did somebody accidentally push a button when they were handling the evidence? If so, then it should have been covered in the plastic bag often used when collecting evidence. Here, though, it was a clear shot. She clicked through as she drank more of her tea. The next few images followed the same pattern, entering the station, going past the different officers' desks, and even a shot of the door to the break room. While it was visibly daytime, the scenes were devoid of people, which would never happen, not even when they were getting photos ready for a press release. Now she was seeing a photo of the door to the forensics lab. Once again, the image was at eye level. On the door was the whiteboard they used to notate their schedules. The photo showed today's date, her name written in bright red marker. Next was an image of the different workstations used by the forensics team. While the lab was further in the back, members of the team had their own workstations they would use for day-to-day tasks. This was followed by more photos that seemed to pass the other desks in the room. She felt a cold sweat start to run down her neck. While she could understand the appeal of a good prank, the officers at the department knew better than to use evidence to play a practical joke. She clicked through again. The photos had gotten deeper into the lab, now entering the realm of violating both police department policy and the law at large. She was now seeing a photo of what was clearly her desk. The chair was pushed in, as though someone was sitting in it. She took a huge swig of her tea, placing the mug down before clicking one more time. The mug was now in the frame. Cornell had been in worse venues. This one at least had a decent locker room where he could get ready. Since he had no one in his corner, he had to make do when wrapping his own hands. It wasn't the first time, and likely wouldn't be the last. It was a new moon, so he likely wouldn't have to worry about losing control. It helped that the ring would be indoors. Something his mysterious benefactor said still bugged him. "I look forward to seeing you fight at your full strength." He knew damn well what he had implied. He wanted the curse to take hold in the middle of battle. He didn't want the man, but the monster. Unfortunately for Mr. Rye, he was stuck with the man. While Cornell knew the curse would give him a much-needed boost in strength, he was not going to dishonor his gym or his Ajarn by relying on it. He would get by on his own skill. Besides, there was too much riding on this. 10 minutes, Wolfie," said one of the attendants. Fortunately, he had finished wrapping his hands with ropes, just as he was taught. He often wondered how the people at his old gym were doing. He hadn't been back ever since the curse first took hold. Although he had a better handle on it, he knew he couldn't go back. Not until he was cured. It wasn't just himself that he was worried about. Ada had only gotten worse. The transformation was already rough on his body, and he was in decent shape. A child, on the other hand, couldn't handle the constant twisting and reshaping of muscle and bone. For her safety, she had to be put in a medically induced coma. The cure Mr. Rye promised would easily lift the curse off of her, allowing her to live a normal life. He got up from the bench and made his way out of the locker room. The attendants, on the surface, appeared to be human. However, he could tell by their smell that they were something different. Some seemed to be undead, due to the distinct scent of stalled decomposition. Others appeared to be beasts like him, albeit with a noticeably different musk. Other attendants weren't as subtle about their supernatural origins. Kind of hard to hide the fact that you're an invisible man or a creature of the night incapable of shape-shifting. He couldn't help but feel a slight sense of parody with them. After the curse had taken hold, he could only find work as a janitor, and even then he had to put up with inhuman treatment from the companies and businesses he was contracted to. Before long, he had walked down the length of the hallway and passed through the large double doors to the room where the ring was set up. Compared to fights he had done in the past, this was actually an impressive-looking venue. The ring was fully lit, and the tiered stands were filled with a raucous audience. The ring announcer was already working the crowd, getting them pumped up. Boasting a 4-1 win record as a human and marking his first fight in the Supernatural Fighting Championship, please welcome Cornell Talbot! He could hear a mixture of boos and cheers as he climbed into the ring. Likely, people were booing because they wanted to see a werewolf enter the ring, rather than a man. Not that it really mattered. He was no stranger to playing a heel in the eyes of the public. And our next fighter, who in life was a formidable soldier serving as a member of Spetsnaz, but now fights long after most people would have given up. Let's give a warm welcome to Alexander Sokolov. Sokolov seemed to match his height, but clearly had more defined and toned muscle, likely the state they were in when he was reanimated. The stitching along his arms and legs indicate that the body reached the point where it could no longer repair itself naturally. A particularly garish scar was in the middle of his chest, likely obtained when he was still alive. His clean-shaven face was in a nigh-permanent scowl, and his eyes had that glazed-over look one usually sees in a subject that clearly had no free will of its own. The referee, who was also a walking skeleton, motioned both Cornell and Sokolov to approach the center of the ring. "All right, you've both been briefed on the rules," he said. "No biting, no hidden weapons, listen to what I say at all times, and protect yourself at all times. To your corners." Cornell's corner had just the one stool for him to sit on, and a staffer to take it away when the round began. By contrast, Sokolov had a full corner team, 3 people in total. One of them was likely the necromancer responsible for his reanimation. Sokolov's hands had also been wrapped with the ropes like his had been, but clearly done by another person. As the 2 fighters stood in their corners, Cornell couldn't tell if Sokolov was sizing him up or if he was just frozen in a state of anger when he died. Soon, the bell rang. Out of reflex, Cornell placed his hands together and stepped into a quick bow. Sokolov, on the other hand, appeared to rush out of the corner, immediately launching his attack. As soon as he got in range, he launched a fast 3-punch combo, jab, cross, hook. Cornell stepped back out of range of the 2 straight punches and then weaved under the hook, stepping off to the side. As soon as his foot touched the ground, he threw a lead leg kick, which crashed into Sokolov's abdomen. He could feel it in his leg. The flesh of the reanimated corpse had been hardened over time. It was like he was kicking a pole. He quickly pulled his leg back and regained range. Sokolov was unfazed and merely turned to face him before unleashing another attack, this time a rear leg body kick, or so Cornell thought. By the time he raised his leg to shield against it, Sokolov unleashed a wide-swinging hook to his head with the opposite hand. Cornell quickly covered with his arm, but the force of the punch caused him to stagger. Sokolov followed up with a shot to Cornell's body, landing right below his ribs. The air was forced out through his mouth, but he knew he wouldn't have time to recover. He brought his arms to his head and crunched his abs down as Sokolov unleashed more punches. Before he knew it, Cornell was backed up to the corner. He had no choice but to put up with the barrage until he could find an opening. It wasn't the smartest strategy, but it was all he could think to do as blow after blow rained down. He managed to protect his head, but his body was getting the worst of it. Fortunately, the opening seemed to present itself as Sokolov wound up for a power shot. It was as though it was being telegraphed to add insult to injury. Was it a trap? Cornell couldn't say, but he also couldn't afford more punishment. He stepped forward, jabbing forward with an elbow strike, connecting on the collarbone. Cornell then straightened his arm, snapping his hand behind Sokolov's head and pulling him down. This allowed him to snake the other arm through, completing the clinch and wrenching Sokolov's head down. From there, he immediately unleashed a flurry of skipping knee strikes. Each knee hit on target, but while that would be devastating to a normal human, the hardened, undead flesh meant that it likely wasn't stunning Sokolov the way Cornell would have expected. He felt Sokolov attempting to throw punches despite the compromised posture. Cornell was able to keep them from connecting due to how his arms were positioned. He wrenched him down further, landing a final knee strike straight into Sokolov's face before breaking away from the clinch, circling out of the corner and regaining space. Sokolov laid down, unresponsive. His corner team proceeded to shout at him in Russian. Meanwhile, the referee began the count. 1, 2, 3, 4. Before the ref got to 5, Sokolov sprung to his feet and turned to face Cornell. His face, while still having the same scowl, now had a noticeably flattened nose. Other bits of skull poked through the flesh of his face, but there was no blood or even any sort of fluid. Sokolov began to march towards Cornell, eager to unleash another volley. It was then that the bell rang, prompting the referee to step in front. Like a machine interrupted, Sokolov returned to his corner. Cornell peeked behind him and saw the stool was put in place. He walked over and sat down, taking deep breaths. He survived the first round. Janie had a demon inside of her. That was what Bishop Olsen had told her. He also told her that the only way to get rid of it was to meet with him privately in his office for counseling. Her parents had thought nothing of the request. He was the bishop, after all, a man of God. He naturally has their daughter's best interests at heart. If he could get her to stop engaging with evil ideals like empathy and climate justice, then they would be happy. The sun hadn't even risen when Janie was dropped off at the church building. Since it was a school day and she didn't attend the seminary classes, this was the only time the bishop could meet with her. Her mother didn't accompany her into the church, just dropped her off with the promise to come back and pick her up when she was done. The door was unlocked, so she stepped inside, passing the main room that housed the pews and the classrooms used for Sunday school until she found the bishop's office in the back of the building. The door was open, and Bishop Olsen was already sitting at his desk. Bishop Olsen was a visibly older man, already in his mid-60s. While he still had a full head of hair, it was already gray, nearly white. His face was framed with a pair of glasses with thick frames. "Good morning, Janie," he said in a warm voice. "Please, close the door behind you." Janie dutifully closed the door as instructed, and then took her seat in a chair across from the desk, placing her hands in her lap. Bishop Olsen stood up and walked in front of the desk, leaning against the edge in a casual manner, as though to say, "Look at me, I'm relatable." He had a stocky build with a round belly, as he was never really one for exercise. Although he would be considered an average height, he towered over the small 11-year-old girl. "I'm happy to see that you've dressed appropriately." Her mother made her wear a plaid skirt that, when standing, hung down to her knees. She never really liked skirts, especially since the ones her mother bought rarely had functional pockets. Didn't help that it was a particularly cold morning, but she had managed to mitigate the chill by wearing a pair of shorts underneath, unbeknownst to her mother. Sadly, it didn't do much for her legs. For her top, she was wearing a bright pink knitted sweater. Not only was it fairly warm, but it also had a design of a cartoon sheep on the front. It was her favorite sweater. "Now, what we'll be doing here is going to seem strange," Bishop Olsen continued, "but it will be for your own good." He lifted himself off of the desk and knelt down to her eye level. He then placed his hand on hers as he looked her in the eye. "That also means that what happens will not leave this room," he said. "Do you understand?" Janie could smell his breath. It was a horrible mix of eggs, coffee, and something else that she couldn't quite recognize. Either way, Bishop Olsen being this close made her feel uneasy. All she could do was nod, as it was taking all of her willpower not to gag. "Good," he said as a smile crept across his face. "Now, let's take care of this demon inside you." He slid his hands over to her knee, which was barely covered by her skirt. His fingers began to reach for the hem. It was at that very moment that Bishop Olsen was suddenly flung into the air, slamming into the ceiling and then crashing onto his desk before rolling onto the floor. The papers, books, and other items were scattered about the room. Janie looked on in fear, not sure what just happened. Her heart was now beating so fast that it would likely have ripped itself out of her body were it not for her rib cage. Bishop Olsen lifted himself off the ground using his desk. His glasses were now broken, and blood was dripping from his nose and the corners of his mouth. He wobbled as he stood, leaning most of his weight on his one arm. He was now wheezing, struggling to get air into his body. "You are right about one thing," a deep, smooth voice said. "There is a demon here, but it's not in her." At that moment, in the chair next to hers, Janie saw a figure begin to materialize. First, she saw the outline of a person, mainly a mix of shadow and distortion. It leaned back casually in the chair, one ankle resting on the other knee. Its head rested on the hand of one arm, while the other was lifted up, reaching towards Bishop Olsen. Soon, more details started to appear on the outline, revealing what looked like a tailored suit made of a smoky, dark gray fabric that almost seemed to shimmer in the light. Cutting through that shimmering were a series of black pinstripes on both the jacket and pants. Beneath the jacket was a jet black vest and a blood-red dress shirt. Completing the outfit was a bright white tie tied in an elaborate eldritch knot, which gave it the appearance of multiple layers. A series of golden lines could be seen on the parts of the knot that were visible to the eye. The face and hands remained in the same mix of shadow and distortion, but she was able to make out what looked like a gaunt face and hair that was shaggy in length, but neat in styling, the wavy locks pulsing in the air. "So, Bishop, how many?" the figure asked. Bishop Olsen sputtered, trying to speak, due to both the blood in his mouth and fear. "How many?" the figure asked again, now louder, with even deeper tones harmonizing with his words, causing the whole room to vibrate. The figure's hand twisted as they spoke, bringing their palm up. Bishop Olsen was wrenched from the ground and lifted into the air. The figure then stood up from the chair and walked toward the desk. At the same time, Bishop Olsen floated and was then pressed into the opposite wall. "You foul demon!" Olsen spat. "Thing of evil! You have no place in a house of God!" The figure let out a chuckle. "Who do you think sent me?" With a wave of the figure's hands, Bishop Olsen slid down the wall and onto the ground. The figure then turned their head towards Janie. "Young miss," they said, their deep voice now carrying a gentle tone, What is about to transpire is not something any child should have to witness. Please leave, and do close the door behind you. Janie slowly got up from the chair and walked towards the door, keeping her eyes on the scene before her. "Do not listen to this monster!" Bishop Olsen ordered. "Quickly, go get help!" "Silence!" the figure shouted as Bishop Olsen was slammed into the floor. The figure then turned back to Janie. "What happens will not leave this room," said the figure. "Isn't that right?" Janie nodded, and then turned, opening the door and stepping through. "Janie! Please!" Janie closed the door as he continued to shout and plead. As soon as the door clicked into place, the entire building fell silent. Her heart was still beating fast as she began taking deep breaths. Cold sweat ran down her neck as she tried to wrap her head around what just happened. At that moment, the knob of the door began to grow hot, prompting her to pull away. Red light began seeping out between the cracks of the doorway. Then, just as quickly as it appeared, the light receded. Unsure of what to do next, she made her way back to the building's main entrance. It was still dark, so she remained just inside the building, keeping the parking lot in view. As there were no chairs nearby, she leaned against the wall. Her breathing grew labored. Then came the tears. She slid down along the wall until she was sitting on the ground. Wrapping her arms around her legs, she brought her face to her knees, muffling her sobs. Her mind was a chaotic mess of emotions. The very concept of words no longer existed, just overwhelming sadness and fear. She didn't know how much time had passed when she heard someone's footsteps. She wiped her face with the sleeve of her sweater and looked over, seeing the familiar dark gray pinstriped pants leg with a pair of polished black dress shoes, which reflected the fluorescent lights of the church building. "You do not need to worry," the figure said softly. "He won't trouble you or anyone else anymore." Rose had been told by her father to never touch the book countless times. Each time she asked why, she was simply told it was dangerous. That's why it always seemed odd that whenever he needed to travel to perform in another city, she was tasked with making sure no one touched it. She wasn't particularly happy being treated as a glorified housekeeper. It didn't help that the house always seemed bigger on the inside and was filled to the brim with a number of precious artifacts from his travels. It was odd how, for someone who by most accounts was a relatively unknown stage magician, he always seemed to have money to have these objects brought to their home. Sometimes they'd be delivered in the usual way, with a delivery driver largely unaware of what they were carrying. Other times, he would bring the objects himself, usually after concluding a series of performances. Despite her frustrations, she dutifully cleaned and maintained the various glass cases and shelves that held various objects, which ranged from things like ancient statuettes, creepy-looking dolls, extravagant jewelry that she was explicitly forbidden from wearing, and other objets d'art. It kept her grounded as she waited for her father to come home. He had changed his stage name multiple times, but was now performing as Vaughn the Vexer. While there had been times where she had been allowed to come with him, that usually was limited to the summer, when she was out of school. That's why she also found it odd, now that she had graduated from high school, she still had to wait until summer to join him on tour. If he was making enough money for these strange artifacts, then surely they'd be able to hire people to look after the place while they were gone. These were the kinds of thoughts that would run through her mind each time she had to dust the shelves. The various objects told parts of a story she couldn't really understand. That made her angry. Her father's evasiveness when she asked about them certainly didn't help. Wasn't the point of gathering these objects into the house to talk about them with visitors? Out of all of the objects on display, the book was what caught her attention the most. It was a large, leather-bound tome. It had an ornate design along the cover that was made out of gold leaf. Gemstones dotted the corners of the front and back covers, with large gemstones embedded in the center of each cover. She could never quite tell what color the gemstones were. In one moment, the cornerstones would be a deep blue and the center stones white, but when she looked away for a moment during her daily cleaning, she would look back and find the stones turned red and black respectively. Perhaps that was the point. She had studied a fair bit of her father's magic books, some even written by Houdini himself, but even with that knowledge, she couldn't figure out how one could pull off such an illusion, especially when she was the only person in the room. Some sort of timer? Maybe the previous owner had a set interval for the colors to change, but then was unable to disable it. She tried documenting what colors she saw at what time, but the changes didn't have a consistent pattern. She gave up after 2 weeks of tracking. Another possibility was that it could simply be a trick of optics, where it has a particular color based on the angle someone was viewing the book at. She tried looking at the book and moving about the room, but the color only appeared to change when she looked away and back, and that was if it changed at all. There had been times where she did double and triple takes, only for the colors to remain the same. One time she tried shutting down the lights in the room. That was how she discovered that the gemstones could glow in the dark. The colors were just as frustratingly inconsistent in the dark as they were in the light. Were they treated with some kind of radium? Could that be why her father told her it was dangerous? There were other objects that were similarly treated that also glowed in the dark. If that was the case, why was the book kept in a completely separate case far from the rest? The curiosity had been eating at her for quite some time. It's not like she had much else to do. Aside from the cleaning, she largely had free reign of the house. She had originally planned on taking a gap year, but between the pandemic and other issues, that gap year had extended into more than 2 years. What few friends she had, if she could call them friends, had since gone on to their colleges of choice, well on their way to pursuing their dreams. It's not like she made any major effort to keep in touch with them. Being the daughter of a stage magician stopped being a novelty when she left junior high. Her limited access to technology had greatly impeded her social life. She had been able to get her schoolwork done thanks to the computers at the nearby library and an internet cafe that would be open overnight, but her lack of a smartphone pretty much guaranteed she was out of the loop when it came to social media trends and similar matters. By most metrics, however, she was regarded positively by most of her peers. Often seen as friendly and outgoing, not one person at her high school had anything bad to say about her. However, most of her relationships were surface level, meaning that if she were holed up in her home for days on end following high school graduation, most people wouldn't even notice. As such, when she wasn't having to clean the house, dust the various artifacts, or do the usual errands one does to maintain a house, she often found herself painfully bored. She had tried various hobbies, but nothing seemed to hold her attention long enough to distract her from her loneliness. She half considered applying her magic knowledge and performing at children's birthday parties, just to have an excuse to get out of the house. It was in these moments of loneliness and boredom that the book seemed to call out to her. It was another late night when she found herself standing in front of the glass case where the book was kept. A sudden storm had dashed her plans to lurk in the internet cafe for a late-night anime binge session, so in the absence of other plans, she was going to sate her curiosity once and for all. She tied her hair back into a ponytail and then pulled a pair of latex gloves over her hands. She made sure to wear a long-sleeved t-shirt and slacks, in case anything were to spill out. She gently lifted the case off the pedestal where the book sat, propped up by a display stand. The scent of old paper and leather filled her nostrils as soon as the case left the pedestal. It was accompanied by the faint hints of metal, likely from the settings for the ever-changing gemstones. She placed the case on the ground and began to reach for the book. At that moment, the lights in the room flickered. The gemstones on the book had changed color again, showing red on the cornerstones and black on the center stones. She was staring right at the book when it happened. The brief second of darkness must have obscured the moment the change occurred. The smell of the book grew stronger as Rose took it into her hands. She ran her hands along the cover, trying to see any sign of a mechanism. The papers appeared to be real, as they seemed to move as she ran her fingers over the edge. The gemstones didn't appear to be buttons of any kind either. There was no give when she ran her thumb over them. She turned the book over and over. The front and back covers were identical. Compared to the cover, the spine of the book was blank, but was noticeably darker in color compared to the leather visible on the cover. Opposite the spine was something she hadn't noticed before, a metal latch that held the book closed. That explained the metallic smell. As she ran her hand over it, a loud thunderclap rang outside the building. A low rumble filled the room, causing the jostling of the glass cases and the various objects they were tasked with protecting. She looked around the room briefly. It didn't look like anything got knocked loose. The storm was more powerful than she anticipated. She took a closer look at the latch. There wasn't any sign of a key or any way to open it. Perhaps this was part of the mechanism for its illusions. She ran her thumb on the edge again. There was another rumble, this time within the book itself. The gemstones hadn't changed. The rumble must have been something else. She held her ear close to the book, shaking it slightly. No sound of anything moving. Perhaps whatever mechanism was inside was engineered not to move, probably to account for travel. She turned the book to its side, facing the metal latch head-on. Was there some sort of trick to open it? Maybe this wasn't a magic prop, but a puzzle. Unfortunately, there was no prim, proper professor to assist her. At that moment, the lights cut out, leaving her in near-complete darkness, save for the gemstones. The cornerstones emitted bright red lights, while the center stones remained dark. She ran her hand over the front of the book, which once again rumbled. The rumbling was growing stronger and stronger, to the point where she struggled to hold on to the book. At that moment, she heard the sounds of the front door opening. "Rosabelle?" her father called from down the hallway. "Are you in here?" Rose quickly placed the book on the display stand. As she lifted her hand away from the book, the latex glove snagged on the corner of the metal latch. As the latex tore, the corner pricked the skin of her thumb, drawing blood. At the same time, the book was now rumbling loudly. Before long, the rumble filled the entire room, and soon the entire house. Soon, Vaughn the Vexer was in the doorway. Somehow, he was able to see Rose in the darkness, whereas Rose could barely make out his features. "Get behind me!" Vaughn shouted. "Now!" "Dad, Rose started. "We'll talk later. Move!" At that moment, the gold leaf of the book now shined with the same red light from the gemstones, but then the light seemed to fade from the corners and gather in the center gemstone. In the next moment, the book snapped open with a bright flash, pages flipping as a powerful gust filled the room. Soon, a bright green vortex emanated from the book, unleashing a number of bright translucent orbs into the room. The orbs then streaked outward, phasing through the walls and out of the house. The pages tore themselves from the book with great force. The other glass cases shattered, the objects knocked over. Rose stumbled to the ground as Vaughn stood firm. A figure began rising out of the vortex. First, a head with gray hair and a gaunt face. Below the head was a black cape with a prominent collar that showed its red lining, framing the head in the middle of a sharp V. The cape covered the rest of the body as the figure ascended, but once their body was fully free, they extended their arms outward, forcing the cape open and revealing their body in full, which was clad in a suit comprised of a black coat, featuring ornate red embroidery on the inner lining, lapels, and cuffs. Beneath the coat was a formal jacket, which also featured ornate embroidery that ran along the front of the jacket where it would close. A red sash wrapped around the waist, and a white cravat hung around the figure's neck, which fluttered in the wind. On their legs were a pair of boots, both as black as the night. "Ah, at last the seal is broken," the figure shouted. "Once again, we are free to stalk the night." He remained floating in the air as he looked down on Vaughn and Rose. "We sealed you once, demon," Vaughn shouted back. "We will seal you again." "I am no mere demon, fool," he said defiantly. "Eu sunt Dracul." He let out a loud, sinister laugh as he spoke. "You, a mere conjurer. You think you can best me, the Lord of Shadow himself?" Faster than Rose could blink, Dracula had materialized in front of Vaughn and lifted him off the ground by his neck with one hand. He held him at eye level while the two remained suspended off the ground. "I could kill you with but a thought," Dracula sneered. "But no. For what your family has put me and my legion through, you do not get a quick death. You will watch as I raise the very world you wish to protect down to the very last cinders." A portal emanating a swirling mix of green fog and bright light appeared behind Vaughn. Then, with what looked like little effort, the magician was tossed inside, disappearing from view as the portal closed. "Dad!" Rose shouted, reaching out in vain. Dracula let out a sinister chuckle. "As recompense for you freeing me, I shall allow you to live. For now," said Dracula. "Heed my words, girl. Do not follow your family's folly. Should you dare to stand against us, I cannot guarantee any mercy." In a flash of ethereal flames and smoke, he vanished. All of the items that had been suspended crashed onto the floor. Rose was left alone in the silence left by the abject destruction. Lying just in front of her was the book, its pages now open, but completely blank. The cover of the cartridge was what caught his attention. Being an avid collector, Nate thought he had collected every possible game from the 8-bit era, including the unreleased prototypes. By most accounts, it was a simple design. A full moon framed within a window pane surrounded by purple curtains. The title also seemed pretty simple too. Escape from Night Manor. It hadn't come up in any listings or searches, not even in the homebrew scene. Weirder still was how it didn't show the name of a publisher or developer. Whether this was homebrew, a lost prototype, or even a bootleg, the fact that the owner of the booth at the swap meet was selling it for only $1 meant it was a deal he couldn't pass up. Bad, good, or mediocre, if it was for his console of choice, he was all over it. After the pizza had arrived, he brought the box over to where he had his console and TV set up. Next to the chair was where he had his webcam and microphone. He kept them in relatively the same positions to make it easy to start a stream. He never drew in major numbers, but he had reached the point where he had established himself as a retro streamer with a focus on obscure games. Tonight, it was his weekly stream, Pizza and Pixels. He turned on the computer and began his stream with the efficiency one only develops from years and years of routine and repetition. What's up, Internet? RetroNate here for another session of Pizza and Pixels, the live stream show where I show you some retro games while I eat pizza. Today, we're looking at something I picked up earlier today at a retro game swap meet. I'm not sure what kind of game it is, so we're going to find out together. He grabbed the cartridge and held it up to the camera. Today's offering is Escape from Night Manor. No developer listed on the cartridge, and I couldn't find any info online, so we're going to see what's on this thing. He loaded it into the console and turned it on. It was one of those third-party consoles that could play games from multiple systems. While he would normally like to play on original hardware, this got along better with his streaming setup, allowing for a clean and easy stream. As the console booted up, he held up the box of pizza to show the camera. And once again, today's pizza comes from our good friends at Luigi's. Support local businesses, people. Today I'm trying their new spicy rosé tteokbokki pizza. They say it has some extra kick, so we'll see just how spicy it is as the game loads up. Being a third-party device, the console took time to start. It first had to load its own firmware, then copy the game's data onto the console. While it wasn't too long of a process, some older cartridges were harder to copy than others due to some proprietary anti-piracy safeguards. As such, Nate used this time to discuss whichever gimmicky pizza he was consuming for his viewers.
Man, the spice doesn't really kick in until it hits the back of the throat, even with the cheese.
By the time he finished grabbing a glass of milk for the spice, the game had finished booting, going straight to the title screen. It matched the sticker on the cartridge, a full moon framed within a 4-panel window frame, which itself was framed by a set of purple curtains. The image was set on the right side of the screen, while the title of the game, Escape from Night Manor, was displayed more prominently, filling the negative space to the left of the image. The font had a blocky but curved design, as though to evoke imagery from a movie poster. Below it, it had the words, Press Start in smaller, less blocky font that resembled a font one would find in a classic book. No music played, but there appeared to be sound effects of wind, albeit in 8-bit form. Just like the cartridge, there was no company information on the screen, nothing that indicated who made the game. Okay, we've got some sound effects, but no company name or even a programmer name. Maybe this was some guerrilla marketing prototype or something? I guess the only way we'll know is by beating it. If it's complete. He pressed the start button on his controller. The window on the screen suddenly shattered, complete with an accompanying sound effect. After the screen faded to black, it brought up a screen showing an old-timey ledger. At the top of the screen was a black word balloon with text written in a font meant to evoke cursive, but tweaked enough to be legible for players who did not read cursive. "May I ask the honored guest's name?" it said. Below that was a line on the ledger, then a full alphabet showing upper and lowercase letters on a darkened background. Okay, so we've got a name entry screen here, so this may be some kind of adventure game. Since the game's being polite, let's enter a proper name. Without missing a beat, he navigated the text entry box, entering the name Nathaniel. To his surprise, the whole name fit without trouble. As soon as he pressed enter, the ledger closed, showing the words Guestbook on the cover in gilded letters. The screen faded to black once again. After a few seconds, an image of a fancy-looking dinner party appeared on screen. Small 8-bit servants in dapper attire were seen weaving through tables, at which sat a number of affluent-looking guests. Because of the graphics, the characters were all rendered in a super deformed style. The sound now had a mix of simulated crowd chatter and classical music. In the center of the room were a group of people dancing. Quite the bougie affair we have here. A murder mystery game, maybe? As though it were responding to his question, a chandelier dropped into the center of the room from off-screen, visibly crushing some of the people. The music came to a halt. A character wearing all red stood on top of the chandelier. The screen faded to black, and then showed a close-up of someone wearing a death's head mask. Another black word balloon was above their head. "You have been marked for death, and shall die one by one. If you escape the manor, you shall survive the night. Die, and you will be doomed to these halls forever." The screen faded again, and then returned to the earlier scene at the dinner party. The shattered chandelier in the middle of the room, and the various people milling about. The red figure once again stood on top of the chandelier, but then floated up and out of frame. Well, that's certainly one way to start. He looked over at his computer. The number of people watching the stream was in the double digits. It was always a slow start for his channel, but at least his efforts were being seen by some people. No one had entered anything into the chat yet. Perhaps they too were waiting to see what the game was about. The screen faded again, and then showed another section of the same room, but this time with one character in the center of the screen. There weren't any particularly noteworthy details, just what looked like a man in a similar dapper suit to the others. Instinctively, Nate pushed on the directional pad of his controller. The character moved. Okay, looks like we're in the game now. Let's see what we're supposed to do. He moved the character over towards some of the people. Once in front of one, he pressed a button on his controller. A text box appeared. "How horrible! Those poor people!" He navigated over to more characters, pressing the button to interact, many of them saying various things indicating a reaction to the chandelier crushing people. Okay, so it looks like we've got some sort of adventure game where we have to escape. That explains the title, I guess. Let's see what happens when we look at the chandelier. The screen scrolled as he made his way to the top. The scrolling revealed the grisly scene. The chandelier, crumpled with the various ornate crystal pieces, shattered. At least, that's how it looked in the limited 8-bit graphics. There were no bodies per se, but the game used patches of red beneath the chandelier to imply the locations of the victims. He brought his character closer and interacted. It was then that Nate felt a scratch on his hand, causing him to yelp. He brought his hand up to his face, finding a cut on his finger, now bleeding. The hell did that happen? He checked his controller to see if there were any jagged pieces of plastic or wire that he may have run his finger on, but none seemed to be present. Hold on, chat, let me get this patched up. He noticed a black text box on the screen. "Ow, you cut your finger on the glass," it said. Talk about eerie frickin' timing. Tel Aviv was the first to fall. They had come seemingly out of nowhere, and despite most common cultural knowledge, weapons did not work on them. Destroying the head, destroying the body, nothing seemed to work, as the bodies would simply reconstruct themselves and continue their movements. By day's end, the military had been decimated, and the streets were nearly empty following the carnage. The next to fall was Xinjiang, and before the end of the week, the path of destruction moved southeast all the way to Beijing. Their sheer numbers overwhelmed the army, and it was soon discovered that deploying weapons indiscriminately merely added to their numbers. Any bystanders in the line of fire would soon join their ranks. Grozny was next, and soon it had spread all the way north to Moscow, and then later to the rest of Russia. Not even the old scorched earth policy seemed to work. No matter how much they destroyed their own cities, their own people, they just kept coming, their ranks swelling by the thousands. The First World wasn't spared either. Hotspots emerged in Paris, London, Rome, and even within the walls of the Vatican. Things accelerated further when it began to affect the Americas. Much to people's surprise, Alberta was the first to be attacked. From there, the mob had overtaken Saskatchewan. Here was where it was discovered that it did not seem to matter how fresh the body was. Corpses, old and new, had emerged from graves both known and unknown to wreak destruction upon the civilized world. It wasn't long before the United States fell victim to the scourge. The first cities hit were the border towns, as no amount of bureaucratic red tape was enough to stop the horde of the undead. Some of them came by land, from the swamps and plantations of the south, the dry deserts of the west, and the still unincorporated forests and plains in between. Others came by sea, having seemingly made the journey on foot across the oceans. Whatever mechanism that kept them from succumbing to the uses of force was seemingly protecting them from the intense pressure of the deep sea and the ravages of weather. In fact, those who had fled to the islands of Hawaii, Guam, and Samoa were caught off guard when the same reanimated corpses had seemingly followed them there. The same was true for those who had fled to the frigid tundra of Alaska, as neither sub-zero temperatures, strong icy winds, nor the heavy snow seemed to deter them. By the end of the month, the world had been overtaken. Not that it mattered much to Vince. He'd been preparing for the end of the world since the last presidential election. He had set up his bunker in the basement, stocking it with all sorts of freeze-dried and canned foods, first aid supplies, and plenty of bullets for his arsenal of guns, ranging from the basic 9mm handgun to his 3D printed assault rifle his friend Chet had made for him. His wife had called him crazy. She took the kids in the divorce. His paycheck was being garnished for child support and alimony, so it had been years since he last saw them. As far as he knew, they were probably as good as dead. In his mind, she probably killed them herself. In spite of everything, communications were still up, so he spent his day, like many others before it, sitting in his reclining chair watching the TV for the latest news. Things hadn't been the same since his favorite host was attacked on air. His favorite channel went dark after that, so he was stuck watching the mainstream crap in order to get any updates. It's not like there was much else to watch anyway. The entertainment world ground to a halt after California was overrun. Too many important people had died. He finagled his computer to connect to his TV to load up some of the streams that were still reporting real news, but many of the people he followed had either died or were holed up in bunkers like he was. Live streaming had the risk of the government finding the bunkers, so many chose to go dark, often putting out text updates. They didn't amount to much more than merely reporting that they were still alive. While he was consciously aware of the days that had passed since the country had gone to hell, each day was very much like the rest. He had sealed up the entrance to his bunker early on, so it had been weeks since he had seen the outside world. He wasn't even sure what the sun looked like anymore. At the very least, he still had access to gas, electricity, and water. He hadn't needed to dip into his reserves yet. Every day he made sure his guns were loaded and ready to fire at a moment's notice. He knew that any day now there would be a final sweep of all the bunkers, and he wasn't going to go down without a fight. His handgun he kept holstered on his waist, only taking it off when he slept, but still keeping it in arm's reach. His rifle he kept next to his reclining chair, ready for whichever poor bastard dared to break through his barricade. A month or so after the attacks began, the TV stations finally went down. While the signal was still up, there were no longer any newscasts or programming running, just a standby message. This left him spending most of his days in relative silence. He would talk to himself on occasion, often rehearsing arguments with his ex-wife, his boss, politician, etc. You could argue with just about anybody when it's in your head, and there were no namby-pamby moderators to interrupt and fact-check you. He wasn't sure how much time passed when he began to hear the scratching from the other side of the barricade that blocked off his bunker from the rest of his house, which he had largely abandoned. He removed the doorknob and blocked the door with sheets of metal and then reinforced it with wood on his side of the barricade. Yeah, he chuckled to himself. Good luck, pal, you're not getting through that. Even if you do, you're getting a face full of lead. At first, he was able to drown it out with his usual tasks, maintaining his guns, prepping his food, and the like. While he had some videos saved on his computer, he didn't have much in the way of entertainment. The TV in his bunker had already been wired to his cable box, and his computer was hardwired to the internet. As such, he didn't see the need to include things like books or movies to pass the time. He hadn't accounted for the fact that TV stations would stop their usual broadcasts to free up space for emergency information. He had also neglected the possibility that the internet infrastructure would meet a similar fate, with all but absolutely essential websites going offline to save power and resources. This left him very little to occupy his time, mainly the videos he had inadvertently saved, the default games that were pre-installed in his computer, and the various manuals for the equipment he had with him. No matter, he thought. He'd make do. That barricade was meant to last, and he wasn't going to risk letting whatever was scratching inside just because of his boredom. More days passed. By this point, he had all but mastered solitaire, seeing the ending screen more times than he could count. The other games were single-level demos of puzzle games, and they required an internet connection to download the rest. Even the assemblage of country, rock, and one track of pre-installed classical music had gotten painfully repetitive. He ended up shutting the computer down for days on end. He needed to save power, after all. This left him with only the sound of the scratching to fill the silence. It had not ceased since it first began. At first, it had largely blended in with the noise of his machines and other tasks. Now that he was trying to save power, it was all he could notice. At least there was something to fill the silence, he thought. It served as a good reminder why he went into his bunker in the first place. Without really anything to pass the time, he found himself spending most of his time sleeping in his recliner. He never figured out how to bring a cot or a mattress into the bunker, so the chair was the next best thing. He at least made sure to bring some blankets, which was a mild relief against the cold basement. Without anything to mark the passing of time beyond the clock on his computer, his body had no way of knowing whether it was day or night. As such, he would sleep until he was awake, and then busy himself with the tasks until he felt sleepy. The only constant was the scratching at the other side of the barricade. He had considered fashioning some makeshift earplugs, but he didn't want to risk not hearing the moment the barricade broke and leave himself vulnerable. As annoying as the noise could be sometimes, eventually his brain would give up trying to think about it and enter sleep out of desperation. It is often during these bouts that he would find himself dreaming of the past. The moments came as brief glimpses, as though his brain was desperate to hold on to what memories it had. This most recent dream was of a time he would spend at a local bar and grill he and his friends would frequent whenever there was a game on. It was home to some of the tastiest garlic bacon burgers one could ever hope to find in this lifetime. Speaking of tasty, his mind had seen fit to recall another thing he liked from the bar. She had just barely started college when she began working there, a short, skinny blonde bombshell who always knew how to make any t-shirt look good. The bar and grill may have aimed for a more family-friendly atmosphere, but she certainly knew how to work it. Having been divorced for nearly 5 years at this point, he would frequent the bar as often as possible. Every time they would chat, he knew there was some chemistry between them. It didn't matter that he was more than 20 years older than her. Age was just a number after all. He often thought about the last night he saw her. It was the night things finally went his way. The poor girl's car had broken down, and he graciously offered to give her a lift home. He had read between the lines. This was the night. As such, he decided to treat her to the scenic route, passing through an area often lauded for the fall colors. However, by the time they arrived, it was already night, limiting the viewing options. They had pulled off to the side of the road, out of view of most of the streetlights. She seemed nervous, and she was really playing hard to get, but the passion overtook them soon enough. As he remembered that night, he could almost feel her tight pink t-shirt, her short black skirt, and that cute blue sports bra. It was a real fight to get them off. They didn't want to cooperate. A loud crash woke Vince from his slumber. It was the distinct cracking of wood and the creaking of metal. The barricade. He dropped the recliner back to its sitting position and leapt up. After scrambling to get his holster onto his waist, he grabbed his rifle and a couple of extra magazines of ammo and ran to the base of the stairs leading up to the barricade. Light peered through an opening that had been created. A skinny arm reached through. The skin was visibly decomposed, as parts of bone could be seen beneath remnants of sinew and flesh. The hand was mostly bone, no doubt a result of getting through the sheets of metal, which were now a series of jagged edges. Vince turned the safety off, loaded the magazine, and fired off a number of shots at the hole. The bullets ripped through the wood and metal. He was pretty sure that it was ripping through the arm and whatever it belonged to on the other side. Still, the arm continued to reach in and move the pieces of wood. He emptied the first magazine. It was still coming. He reloaded and fired again, this time going fully automatic. The arm fell from the shoulder it was attached to and began tumbling down the stairs, only for it to stop mid-descent. Then, as if by magic, it floated into the air and returned to its original position, whereupon it resumed its efforts to clear the barricade. More of the wood was easier to clear out now that it had been riddled with bullets. Another arm entered the same hole and tore away the sheet metal from the other side. This flooded Vince's eyes with light, leaving the figure in silhouette. Vince fired again, taking no care to aim. The bullets sprayed wildly up the stairs, with more shots missing than connecting. Suddenly, the rifle exploded. His wild firing had caused the gun to jam, with a bullet failing to clear the barrel before the next shot. His vision was clouded with a mix of fire and shrapnel. Miraculously, none of it had gotten to his eyes. However, his hands were now effectively useless. His left hand had been steadying the gun as he fired while the right was squeezing the trigger. Now they were both missing fingers, and he was losing blood. Fast. His ears were still ringing, and the flash had temporarily blinded him. As his vision returned, he saw that the barricade was now gone. A lone figure was shambling down the stairs towards him. Vince staggered back until he was against the wall opposite the stairs. Like the arm, the rest of its body had bits of decomposing flesh and muscle clinging to the bones. What parts of the scalp remained had long blonde hair streaking from it, although it was visibly dirty, as though it had previously been covered in soil. It wasn't clear what remained of the torso, but as it got closer and closer, Vince could see a pink t-shirt, the collar torn and stretched, revealing a blue sports bra that hung closer to the neck, as though it had been pulled up to expose the rib cage. A short black skirt hung at the corpse's waist. It was nearly sundown when we had gathered at the meeting spot. Alan and I had arrived around the same time. Bryn was already there waiting for us. No doubt she was the most anxious to get this over with. I set down the heavy utility bag I had brought and began to pull out the tools we would need. It was a pretty simple loadout. Each of us would be equipped with a silver stake and mallet. We would also have 3 vials each of blessed waters. I hesitate to call them holy, since we were effectively taking advantage of a Vatican loophole to source it. Apparently, the person I got it from says the holy water dates back as far as Pope John Paul II. As for additional weapons, we each had our preferences, but as the one tasked with maintaining them during the other parts of the year, I had since become intimately familiar with them. For Alan, it was his classic buckler and short sword. While it was nowhere near the quality of the sword and shield he had used back then, he had long since adjusted to the shorter range. At the very least, he was now able to counter more quickly. For myself, it was my tried and true companion, Ogami Maru. It was gifted to me during one of my training journeys, but it's believed to have been originally forged during the final days of the Edo period by a supernatural swordsmith now lost to time. It's been proven effective against both natural and unnatural foes. As for Bryn, the one person most eager to put the past behind her just so happened to have the most complicated weapon out of the 3 of us. While she had done some modifications on her own, neither she nor I have ever been able to figure out how it worked. It was a set of 2 rings with handles down the center. When armed, a single-edged blade would protrude from the bottom. A number of switches and triggers were hidden within the handle, and, when pressed, the blades would shoot out from the rings with chains fastened to their base, allowing her to fight at long range. Other switches would allow her to retract the chains, and even change the rate at which they would release or retract. We're not sure what magic allows the blades to be propelled with enough force to penetrate metal, as the original person who created the weapons has long since left the world. All I've been able to do while the weapon was in my care was at least oil the mechanical components. Not sure if it helps, but it's something. No words were spoken as we armed ourselves. Deep down, not one of us was looking forward to what we had to do. This was at least our 3rd reunion since our fates were bound to this remote section of forest in the west. It was at least an hour's walk from the campground where we had parked. Fortunately, the only people that usually visit this stretch of woods were people hunting for morel mushrooms, but that was only in the spring. Here it was the latter end of fall. Our trek to our destination was also in silence. Our task lied further in the woods, where the trees grew thicker, and where one could find some of the lesser-known caverns that were nestled within the mountain. It was good that we had all worn heavier jackets, as the temperature was dropping fast. We kept our ears trained on our surroundings, monitoring for anyone who either sought to stop us or merely wandered where they need not wander. Bryn was at the front, Alan in the middle, while I brought up the rear. In addition to our weapons and tools, we had armed ourselves with some powerful flashlights, which proved more and more necessary as the sun finished setting and the night closed in. I'm not sure how much time had passed, but I knew we had arrived. To bystanders, this would just appear to be a seemingly innocuous rock face alongside the mountain. To us, it was a hidden cavern, only accessible to those with both the knowledge and ability. The 3 of us stood facing the stone, and each held out our dominant hands. It was then that the brands appeared on our palms. When they placed them on us, they told us they were the source of our powers. Being just children, we believed them. While I can only speak for myself, my hand would always burn whenever it appeared. I'm not sure if it was due to the fact that it was a brand, or if it was linked to the element that it represented. The brands each glowed with a unique color and showed different symbols that matched our element, as we understood them. They were alchemical symbols, signs we had seen before through cultural osmosis. Alan's brand was Mars, and glowed red like fire. Bryn's was Mercury, shining blue like water. Mine was Jupiter, and the yellow we figured was lightning. We each grit our teeth as the brands shone, and soon a line parted down the middle of the rock face. 2 large slabs of stone moved from one another, opening up to reveal a long path within a cavern. We lowered our hands and took a quick look at one another before setting foot inside. What followed was another long, silent trek in near total darkness, save for the flashlights we brought with us. After a mostly level walkway, we eventually began descending a long stone staircase. We could hear the echo of our footsteps all around us. The further we descended, the closer the walls seemed to become. I wasn't sure if the passage was actually narrowing or if it was merely the lack of light playing tricks on my mind. Without any light, we couldn't tell just how long we'd been walking. We had no watches or even phones with us. We didn't want to risk anyone finding this place should the worst happen. All we could do was walk forward. If we turned back, then the spells and other mechanisms in place would likely trap us inside. After an agonizingly long amount of time, we descended the final steps and were back on level ground. Here we were finally beginning to see light that wasn't from our flashlights. It was shining in the distance through a slit at the other end of the path. It wasn't enough to see our surroundings, but it at least indicated that we were nearly there. As we got closer and closer, we soon came face to face with a large set of stone doors. Unlike the slabs that opened the main entrance, these were carved, although we weren't sure by what. Ornate symbols and runes formed a trim along the top and sides of the doorway. The doors themselves were chiseled with a solid recess down the center of each one. They seemed to align with the symbols along the top of the doorway. In addition to a gap down the center, there were gaps between the top of the doors and the frame of the doorway, as well as the gaps along the bottom with a small amount of space between the doors and the ground. The light shining from the other side was bright, but cold. We took no comfort in it, as we knew what was on the other side. We spread ourselves apart and faced the door. One by one, we each turned off our flashlights, and we were soon standing in the bleak darkness of the cavern. Once again, we held up our hands and called forth our brands. As the faint glow fell onto the stone doors, a symbol began to trace itself upon them, shining with an almost otherworldly green hue. It was a cross enclosed within a circle, the alchemical symbol of Earth. Soon, the brand faded, and the doors swung open of their own accord, flooding the cavern with the very light that was shining from behind. As our eyes adjusted, we saw a spacious square room. At the corner of each room was a lantern that shone with the cold white light, a translucent shell surrounding the light source in order to better spread the light throughout the room. The walls were just as ornately carved as the doors, but this time in a style more akin to a temple like the Parthenon, with simulated Grecian columns and reliefs, although I wouldn't be able to tell you what any of it meant. We weren't the ones who built it, it had more or less formed on its own. At the center of the room was the very reason we were here. Compared to the walls, it was a very plain-looking section of stone, raised from the ground. One could be forgiven for assuming it was some sort of a table due to its unassuming appearance, but we knew better. It was no table. It was a coffin. The time had come for us to conduct our awful enterprise, as a certain Dutch professor would put it. We took off our heavier coats and readied our individual weapons. We then began to cautiously approach the coffin. As soon as we were within arm's length, the top slab of stone began to crumble. However, rather than pieces of stone falling away, it was more like the stone was reducing itself to sand and flowing away. Once the lid had cleared, we saw her. She was a young woman. No, it would be better to describe her as a child, no older than 17 at the most, the same age we were when we were chosen to save the world. Her face showed no sign of decomposition. On the contrary, it was as youthful as it ever was. If we didn't already know better, one would be forgiven for assuming she was in a deep sleep, as her face looked so peaceful. The outfit she rested in was a weird mix of formal dress and battle armor, the kind of outfit often reserved for artistic murals and operatic reenactments of great battles. The dress-like elements were seen on her arms, legs, and shoulders, cloth of a bright emerald green. The armor was seen on her hands, feet, and torso, offering decent protection but with a design that clearly prioritized maneuverability. Her head was crowned with a headdress caught between a headband and a tiara. It covered a fair bit of her forehead and acted as the perfect frame for her face. This was the Lana we had known, the one who had fought alongside us in many of our battles against evil, the Lana who, when we were on the verge of utter defeat and calamity all those years ago, made the most noble sacrifice, and now lied here entombed in the very clothing she died in. That knowledge made what we were here to do all the more painful. The visual flow of her outfit was interrupted by 3 stakes, one in her throat, one in the center of her chest, and one in her solar plexus. Unlike the ones we brought with us, these showed signs of visible tarnish and degradation. The amount of rust and rot made it difficult to tell that they were once silver at all. The dark energy within the body was working its way through them, and, if not replaced soon, they would wither away, undoing the only seal keeping the entity now housed within from terrorizing the modern world. We took our respective positions. I stood at one end of the coffin, closest to her head. Bryn and Alan stood on the sides of the coffin. We each took a hold of a tarnished stake. I took hold of the one in the throat. Bryn took hold of the one in the chest, and Alan the one in the solar plexus. We all looked at each other and gave a knowing nod. None of us said a word, but we all acted on the same count of 3, pulling the stakes up. As soon as the stakes left the body, the eyes and mouth shot open. The once peaceful face contorted into a violent, bestial expression of rage, and the crypt was filled with a low, guttural scream that was a cacophonous symphony of human anguish and demonic anger. A horrifying chorus that contained faint notes of Lana's voice, but largely overpowered by what now resided within the body. A burst of energy pushed out from the coffin in a shockwave, knocking each of us back. We drew our weapons as we looked on. The body rose into the air, sharply turned upright, and spun to face the 3 of us. The nails on the fingers grew long and sharp. The fingers splayed out to an unnatural width as the shoulders hunched together. The skin grew even more pale. The veins, filled with black blood, seemed to poke out from beneath. The sclera of her eyes were pitch black, and the mouth hung open to reveal sharp teeth. The dark energy pulsed throughout the body, causing the hair and loose parts of clothing and armor to flutter violently as though a storm of wind was ripping through the room. As the scream now bellowed into a demonic roar, the doors to the crypt slammed shut. The only way for us to get out now was to see our horrid task through to the very end. It lunged for me first, diving down like a bird of prey, claws first. I parried the strike and stepped off the line of attack, sending her behind me into where the wall met the floor. Alan quickly advanced with a thrust, but a wild swing knocked the blade away before it could connect. It then swung with the other hand. Alan barely managed to deflect the sharpened claws with his buckler. He backed up and took a defensive position, the tip aimed forward. I circled around, holding my blade in a low stance as I crouched, trying to make myself a smaller target. It paused for a moment, whipping its head back and forth as though trying to decide where to strike. It then set its eyes upon Bryn, who had hung back and, at least to its field of view, was right between us. It leapt over our heads and made its way towards her. Alan and I attempted to thrust up as it moved, but couldn't even get so much as a scratch. Before we knew it, it bounded over the coffin right at her. As it was about to bring its claws onto her face, Bryn pressed one of the switches on her weapon, and the blade shot out, punching through its chest and embedding itself in the far wall. At the same time, she dropped down onto her back and pulled the chain toward her shoulder, making it taut. This gave Alan and I the time to come up from behind and each slash at its arms respectively. I was able to sever it with a clean cut, whereas Alan was only able to make it halfway through, just enough to keep it from slashing Bryn. I immediately followed up with a slash at its neck, but much like Alan, I could only get halfway through, failing to sever the head. No blood came out as a result of the dismemberment, just a shadowy vapor. However, time was limited, as it would soon reassemble itself if we didn't act fast. I pressed the blade further, wrenching the body back from Bryn. She quickly returned to her feet and backed up further, keeping the chain as taut as her strength would allow. Alan added the strength of his blade to mine, using its position embedded within the arm to further push it back. It attempted to slash at him, but he was somehow able to keep the arm pinned. We slowly pushed it back towards the coffin, the chain ripping through the torso as it thrashed about. It had embedded himself in the upper part of the wall, which led to the chain running through the body at an angle. As it continued to thrash and writhe, the chain moved up the torso. It was now at shoulder level. Any higher and it would wriggle free. Alan and I attempted to press on the chain with our swords to keep it from going higher, but that seemed to be the kind of opening it needed. Alan was knocked back with the remaining arm, causing the chain to rattle about and eventually rip from the shoulder. I soon found myself pressed up against the wall and off the floor as the severed arm reattached itself to the body almost instantly. My hands, and by extension the katana, were pressed into my sternum, and I could feel the nails start to cut through the clothing on my chest just behind the tsuba. I felt a crushing weight pushing into my body through its arm. If the nails didn't cut me, my bones would certainly break. In the next instant, it let out a scream, clearly of pain. Alan had managed to thrust his sword into its body, causing it to release its grip on me. I slid down the wall, but I knew I had no time to catch my breath. I immediately thrust upward into its belly, which happened to intersect with Alan's sword. This allowed us to force it back down to the ground and angle ourselves out of range of its arms. Bryn, whose blade was still embedded in the wall, brought the chain close and wrapped it around the arms. She then released the chain on the second ring, but more slowly, until it was long enough to feed between the arms and reinforce the first chain. Step by agonizing step, we pushed it along the ground back to the coffin, sliding it along the floor. Once we were close enough, Bryn used the 2 chains to hoist it back up into the air, thereby allowing us to force it back into the coffin. We kept our blades angled down once it landed to keep it from coming back out. I quickly took hold of Alan's hilt and pressed both swords into the coffin. Alan immediately rushed back to the side of the coffin, pulling out his silver stake and mallet. He placed it over the solar plexus, narrowly avoiding the chained arms as he drove the tip in. It began to let out a loud scream of pain, this time one that sounded more human. As soon as it broke through the skin, the lower extremities stopped moving. This allowed me to pull out the swords and take the chains from Bryn, pulling them tight. This in turn allowed Bryn to reach the side of the coffin opposite Alan's, placing her stake in the middle of the chest. As soon as it broke through, the arms went limp. The screaming persisted, but some of the lower guttural noises had diminished further. I let go of the chains and quickly took my position at the head of the coffin, pulling out my stake and placing it over her throat. As soon as the skin broke, the lower rumblings of the scream were gone. It was now the distinct sounds of Lana's own voice. The sclera of her eyes turned back to their natural white color as black tears began to fall. The scream was now a stifled gasp for air, and her expression was now one of extreme pain, but also extreme anguish. We all looked into Lana's eyes, our hammers at the ready. "Do it!" she shouted as she squeezed her eyes shut. 1, 2, 3. We pounded the stakes in the same unified motions. Upon the third strikes, the expression of pain and anguish disappeared instantly, the face resuming its peaceful expression. As the final part of the ritual, we pulled out the bottles of blessed waters and poured them over our respective stakes. Once that was done, the sands that had comprised the stone lid of the coffin reconstituted, sealing her inside once again. It was a long, silent, agonizing walk back. Although our task was done, none of us were in any mood to speak, or really do much else. Even when we were once back outside, it was little comfort. Another hour's walk, and we were back at the campground where we had met up. It was the dead of night, but since it had been overcast, no stars shined in the sky. Not even the moon could be seen. As the 3 of us stood in the darkness, we all looked at each other, although by this point it was too dark to see anything. I don't know what was in their minds, but I know there was a lot I wanted to say, but couldn't. Without a word, I put Alan and Bryn's weapons back into the utility bag where I had kept them. Once again, it fell to me to maintain and keep them ready for the next time, whenever that may be. We then went our separate ways. That is the end of our final tale, and the end of our time together. Allow me to once again thank you for both your time and attention. I hope these stories, as inconsistent as they may be in their quality, provided a nice diversion befitting of the season. Whether you are enjoying the holiday with friends, family, or even alone, allow me to wish you a very happy and spooky Halloween. But for now, dear viewer, I bid thee good night.